Dash cams froze the moment. An ATR 72600 heeling over the Taipei skyline, its wings scything a bridge before vanishing into the Keelung River. Seconds earlier, one engine faltered, and the pilots killed the other. What could twist a life-or-death checklist into a trap? Inside the cockpit, alarms piled atop shouted callouts. Outside, commuters watched a routine takeoff turn into a knife-edge dive. Blame settled quickly on pilot error, but the buried clues in maintenance logs, training records, and system logic tell a darker story. Follow the trail that turns a split-second mistake into a preventable catastrophe. From the moment Flight GE235 rolled down runway 10 at Taipei's Songshan Airport, nothing appeared unusual. Morning traffic pulsed across the city's elevated roads. The Keelung River lay ahead as the de facto noise corridor, and the ATR 72600 accelerated cleanly in clear daylight. Rotation, positive rate, gear up. The rhythm of a routine departure carried the turboprop past the airport boundary and over the river's bend. On the flight deck, the captain flew, the first officer monitored, and a third pilot observed from the jump seat. A full cockpit for a short hop to Kinmen. Climb power came in, flaps progressed toward retraction, and for several dozen seconds, the aircraft tracked east, crossing just north of downtown rooftops, toward a shallow left-hand turn that would keep it clear of Taipei's close-set obstacles. Then the tape picks up the first hints that this would not be a normal climb. Flight data later showed an abrupt torque drop on the right engine, accompanied almost immediately by cockpit alerts, the kind that overwrite mental checklists with insistent chimes and red text. Within moments, the crew transmitted, "Mayday, Mayday, engine flameout," and Songshan Tower cleared them to return. The ATR, still light on fuel, still well within its engine-out performance envelope in theory, should have lived in that margin. Instead, the margin began to close. Airspeed, once alive and increasing, staggered. Pitch hovered nose up as the pilots tried to trade precious knots for climb to buy time and space. The stick shaker fired, warning of an approaching stall. A synthetic voice called bank angle and stall over the intercom of human speech and checklists, half started, half abandoned. Investigators would later reconstruct the geometry with relentless clarity. The aircraft reached roughly 1,600 feet above mean sea level before its energy bled away. In the turnback, initiated left to keep over water, the ATR's bank angle increased as asymmetric thrust and rudder inputs pulled the nose and wing down toward the river. The left wing dropped, the right rose. Angle of attack spiked beyond the safe envelope. The stall warning recurred, oral alerts layering over each other until they lost their meaning and became a single, continuous alarm. Instead of leveling off, the bank steepened. The data trace shows the roll passing 60 degrees and pushing toward 80 degrees, far past what any climb on one engine can sustain, and fatal at the speed they now carried. Airspeed decayed toward VR figures, well below the target climb speed for an engine-out departure, and the elevator was working hard to hold the nose level above the city's edge. Outside the cockpit, the flight path threaded low over the water, the airplane yawing and rolling left as it descended. Dashcoms captured the last seconds, the ATR crossing an elevated roadway that shadows the Keelung River, its left wing visibly low, the fuselage already tilting. At the river's edge, the wingtip and then the full leading edge scythed into the concrete barrier, and a moving taxi, shearing the wing and wrenching the aircraft further into roll. The impact tore the structure. A beat later, the fuselage slammed into the river, breaking apart in a spume of water and debris. On board, 58 souls had been strapped in for a 200-kilometer hop. In the space of 2.5 minutes, the climb had turned into a near-inverted, low-altitude stall from which recovery was nearly impossible. The motions on the instruments make the end chillingly direct. Height gained, height squandered, speed lost, bank exceeded, wing struck. The human voices threaded through it, mayday, stall, bank angle. Do not slow the physics. But the trace also records earlier, decisive moments. The right engine's anomaly that triggered the first alarm, and the subsequent power and condition lever movements that shaped the airplane's fate. to understand how a single engine problem became a dual loss of thrust. We have to go back to the turning point that followed those first warnings. The decisive break from survivable emergency to doomed flight happened fast enough to hide inside a single breath. As the ATR 72-600 climbed out of Songshan, the right engine, number 2, mounted on the starboard wing, registered an abnormality. Flight data, later reviewed by Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council, showed a sharp drop in right engine torque and the activation of associated warnings. Whether framed as a flameout or a transient power loss, the system logic treated it as a failure. Oral alerts sounded, master cautions illuminated, and the aircraft entered a regime where standard practice is to stabilize the climb, identify the failed side, and execute the memory items with care. The crew declared an emergency almost immediately and were cleared to return. The geometry of the problem was straightforward. The psychology was not. Engine number 2's parameters told a clear story to anyone who could read and cross-check them. Torque dropping, indications consistent with the right side being the problem. In the cockpit, however, verbal cues and instinct began to diverge from the instruments. The captain, hand-flying and wrestling the initial yaw, moved first to reduce power, but on the left. Data from the power lever angle shows number 1's thrust pulled back toward flight idle, while the right side remained compromised. The airplane's energy state, already narrowing at low altitude, bled faster. Airspeed sagged while drag and asymmetric forces grew. What should have been a one-engine climb toward a wide, forgiving corridor over the river tilted toward an all-engines-lost scenario, and the margin for diagnosis shrank with every knot surrendered. Seconds matter in engine failures after takeoff. On this day, the next seconds sealed the outcome. Instead of confirming the ailing right engine and safeguarding the left as the lifeline, the captain reached for the left engine's condition lever, the guarded control that selects feather and, beyond a detent, fuel shutoff. The flight data recorder captured the movement. The cockpit voice recorder captured the concurrent stress calls. With that single action, the good engine's propeller was feathered and its fuel cut. Whatever intermittent thrust the right engine might still have been producing now stood alone against the drag of a feathered prop and a high angle of attack. The aircraft was no longer managing an engine-out climb. It was descending on almost no usable power at a few hundred feet above a dense cityscape. Investigators later emphasized that the right engine was not catastrophically destroyed, and by design, its propeller system could reduce drag to help control yaw. But with the left engine intentionally shut down, control inputs and throttle movements on the remaining side could not overcome the combined penalty of low airspeed, increasing bank, and the lift that disappears the moment an ATR's wing crosses a critical angle of attack. In the background, air traffic control heard clipped transmissions. Mayday, engine flameout, without the crucial clarification of which engine had been secured. The crew initiated a restart attempt on the left only when the nose had already begun its fatal drop. Spooling a turboprop from fuel cut to thrust is not instantaneous, and the attempt came too late to matter. The turning point is stark in the recorder's side-by-side traces. A right-side anomaly, followed by left-side power reduction, then left-side shutdown, then a belated effort to unwind the mistake. The sequence explains the airplane's accelerating roll to the left, the repeated stall warnings, and the final sweeping strike of the left wing against the bridge. It also pushes past the shorthand of pilot error into the harder question. How, under training that drills identify, confirm, then act, did a captain close the throttle and cut fuel on the only healthy engine? The answer lies in what the cockpit sounded like and felt like in those crowded seconds. Alarms layering, call-outs overlapping, the cognitive fog of low-altitude startle that can make the wrong lever feel like the right one. That is where we go next, inside the sensory overload and procedural confusion that turned a manageable failure into a mortal one. Open the cockpit voice recorder from those minutes, and the first impression is not of words, but of noise. A chime announces a caution, then another. The synthetic stall alert cuts through. The bank angle call repeats. The radio carrier breaks in from Songshan Tower. Layered over that are three human voices: the captain flying, the first officer monitoring, and an additional pilot in the jump seat. In training, the engine failure drill sounds crisp: identify, confirm, act. But at 1,000 feet with flaps moving, a turn beginning, and airspeed bleeding away, the drill becomes a negotiation among alarms, muscle memory, and a cockpit hierarchy suddenly under stress. The right engine's power drop should have anchored the crew's attention to starboard indications and yaw. The data shows there were cues: a torque decrease on the right, system messages that pointed to engine 2. The CVR indicates that engine 2 flameout was verbalized early. Yet just as the oral picture grew crowded, the airframe's behavior began to play tricks. With the left turn coming on and rudder inputs wrestling the asymmetry, the seat of the pants sense of which side was failing grew less reliable. Startle effect, an initial surge of stress hormones that narrows perception, doesn't just speed up the heartbeat. It tunnels attention to the threat most loudly presented. Here, that became stall protection, not engine diagnostics, and the captain's cognitive bandwidth contracted under the din. Procedurally, this is the moment when discipline must carry the day. The operator's standard calls demand a challenge and response before any condition lever is moved. The pilot monitoring points to the suspect side, calls the item, the pilot flying confirms, and only then does the shutoff proceed. In these seconds, the ritual frayed. The captain, hands busy on the yoke and power quadrant, moved the left power lever toward idle, contrary to the cues and contrary to the crew's own words. The first officer, who should have enforced the cross-check and physically guarded against the wrong lever, was voicing check items and responding to the constant warnings, a divided attention that created just enough slack for the irreversible step to slip through. When the left condition lever went past the detent to fuel shutoff, the error was complete. Human factors researchers point out how the ATR's throttle quadrant, symmetrical by design, can invite motor memory errors under pressure if the identify-confirm discipline erodes. The 600's glass displays consolidate engine parameters on a central screen. In theory, that simplifies scanning. In practice, the crew's eyes were bouncing between airspeed, attitude, and terrain because the geometry they were flying, low, turning, decaying speed, was now the existential problem. The machine was shouting about angle of attack and bank. The radios demanded plans. The checklists competed for a sliver of attention. Under that load, crew resource management degraded. The jump seat pilot's early identification of the right side issue did not translate into a veto when the left side lever moved. The first officer's attempts to progress the memory items were not matched by the captain's confirmations. Authority gradients, who feels entitled to say stop, loom large in such moments, and here, the gradient held when it needed to flatten. Compounding the confusion was a subtle trap in timing. When ATR's automatic systems respond to a genuine flameout, they can up-trim the good engine and feather the failed propeller, altering the cues a pilot expects to feel. If that automation doesn't behave exactly as rehearsed, or if its cues are masked by other alerts, the mental model can lag the reality. In GE235's cockpit, by the time the crew fully processed the right side anomaly, their actions had already crippled the left side. The ensuing stall warnings monopolized attention, and the attempt to restart the good engine came only as the aircraft rolled through a steep bank over the river, a point at which the checklist could no longer buy back lift or time. This is not to excuse the breach of procedure. It is to map how, second by second, a well-known drill unraveled in the sound and fury of a low-altitude emergency. Understanding that unraveling requires a close look at the safeguards designed into the ATR 72-600 for exactly this scenario. What, precisely, were the aircraft's engine protections trying to do that morning, and how should the crew have read and used them after a genuine flameout? To decode those crowded seconds, start with what the airplane was programmed to do for its crew. On the ATR 72-600, a suite of protections stands ready for the exact moment one engine falters after takeoff. Chief among them is the Automatic Takeoff Power Control System, or ATPCS. a logic chain that constantly samples torque, propeller speed, and configuration during the high-risk phases of takeoff and go-around. When its conditions are met, power set for takeoff, flaps in the departure range, and both engines initially producing thrust, a sudden torque drop on one side should trigger two automatic responses: up trim on the operating engine and auto feather on the failing one. Up trim commands the good engine to its higher takeoff rating within its temperature limits. Auto feather rotates the blades of the failed propeller to a low drag angle, sharply reducing asymmetry and drag. The system also announces itself with cockpit indications signaling ATPCS armed, up trim engaged, and the affected propeller feathered. In other words, if the failure is genuine, the airplane buys the crew time, more thrust where it still exists, less drag where it doesn't, and it throws visual cues onto the screens to help them name the correct side. Standard procedures are written around that choreography. After an engine failure at or just after liftoff, the pilot flying holds attitude for V2, the takeoff safety speed that preserves climb performance. The pilot monitoring calls positive rate, and the gear comes up. The next scripted cross-checks are explicit. Verify up trim, verify auto feather. If both have occurred, the crew stabilizes on one engine climb profile, banks a few degrees into the live engine to center the slip skid indicator, and resists the urge to rush. The power management selector goes from TU to MCT, maximum continuous thrust, on the operating engine, keeping it within limits while preserving performance. Only once stabilized and clear of immediate obstacles do they move to the identify, confirm, act sequence. Match instrument cues and yaw to the suspect side, guard the correct lever. Then, with both pilots pointing and agreeing, move the failed engine's condition lever to feather and, if required, to fuel shutoff. The dense simplicity of that ritual exists to keep hands from wandering to the good side under pressure. The ATR's protections extend beyond ATPCS. Stall prevention intrudes loudly if airspeed decays. First the stick shaker, then, if the envelope is pressed, the pusher that nudges the nose down to preserve airflow over the wings. The yaw damper and rudder bias systems help counter the rolling and yawing moments after an asymmetry, easing the workload while the pilot holds attitude. Engine electronic controls meter fuel to respond smoothly to thrust demands, and propeller control units keep blade pitch coordinated with power lever position. All of it is designed to make the cues unambiguous. One side surges, the other side's drag collapses, the slip ball and heading tell you which foot needs pressure, and the central display spells out which engine wants attention. But these protections are not omnipotent, and they depend on preconditions. ATPCS must be armed by configuration and power setting. Retard a power lever below the expected range, and its logic can drop out. Auto feather will not occur outside its design envelope, and uptrim cannot help if the surviving engine is itself pulled back or shut down. Nor do the alerts reorganize themselves to match human bandwidth. On a day when angle of attack warnings and bank angle calls dominate the cockpit, the ATPCS cues are competing with louder demands. That is why operators integrate the system's behavior into memory items. Up trim, check. Auto feather, check. A verbal touchstone that forces eyes to the right lines on the screen before any lever moves. In a genuine flameout, this design buys altitude and seconds. The healthy engine's added thrust offsets the yaw without requiring abrupt rudder. The feathered propeller reduces drag to a manageable nuisance, and the airplane climbs away on V2 while the crew sets MCT and cleans up flap as the profile allows. If ATPCS does not perform, say, a sensor fault or an out-of-conditions failure, the procedure branches. Manually set maximum continuous on the good side, and move the failed side's condition lever to feather per checklist, but still only after the same identify and confirm barrier. The point is not speed. The point is sequence and verification, because once a condition lever moves past the detent to fuel cut, the mistake is irreversible without precious time and altitude to restart. Applied to that morning in Taipei, the contrast is stark. The right engine's anomaly should have triggered up trim on the left and, if criteria were met, feathering on the right, creating a tactile and visual pattern that guided the crew's hands safely. Instead, the left power was reduced, and then the left condition lever was moved toward shutoff, stripping away the very protections the system had tried to erect. With the good engine silenced, no amount of automation could summon thrust, and the stall warnings that followed drowned out whatever clues remained. The airplane did not fail to help. It was overridden before it could. If systems are the script, maintenance is the stagecraft that ensures the cues appear when they should. The reliability of torque sensing, propeller control, and ATPCS arming matters when seconds decide outcomes. The record of this airframe's recent defects and fixes around those components would become central to understanding how much trust the crew could place in the lights and logic in front of them. If the ATR's safety nets are the script, the maintenance shop is where the props are checked before the curtain rises. Investigators went there early. They pulled the line logs for B22816, the ATR 72600 that would not complete its climb from Songshan, and read back through weeks of routine entries and the occasional red ink fault. The aircraft was young, less than a year in service, and new types carry their own teething quirks. In this case, the focus narrowed to 3 interlocking systems: torque sensing on each Pratt & Whitney PW127M engine, the Hamilton Sundstrand propeller control units that command blade angle, and the automatic takeoff power control system, ATPCS, that ties them together during the most vulnerable minutes of flight. The record shows what mechanics everywhere recognize: intermittent flags that come and go on the ground, and that can be maddening to trap. In the month before the crash, the fleet saw several write-ups across multiple airframes for nuisance cautions on power management and ATPCS arming. B22816 was not immune. Log pages cited abnormal torque split indications and an ATPCS test that needed to be rerun before dispatch, a check that, when repeated per procedure, passed. TransAsia's technicians swapped components along the troubleshooting tree in accordance with manuals. A torque signal pathway was inspected and connectors cleaned. A propeller control unit was removed and replaced on a previous discrepancy. Rigging checks were performed to confirm the relationship between the power levers in the cockpit and the fuel metering on the engines. Each intervention ended with the same line: "Ops check good." The morning of the accident, the airplane's before takeoff checks included an ATPCS armed verification. Data retrieved later confirmed the system was armed, and when Engine 2's torque decayed after liftoff, the logic moved to help. Up trim available on the left, and autofeather prepared on the right if conditions held. The Aviation Safety Council would ultimately state that the protections were available and behaving as designed until the crew's actions took the good engine below the thresholds that keep ATPCS logic alive. That finding matters. It means the airplane's cues, the very ones drilled into simulator sessions, should have been there for the taking. The maintenance history did not show an unresolved defect that preordained a failure of autofeather or uptrim. Still, the context is not irrelevant. In post-accident interviews, company pilots described occasional ghosts in the 600's power management enunciations in the fleet's early months, faults that cleared on reset, test sequences that needed a second try to arm cleanly. None of these rose to the level of a no-go item once corrected, and none were tied causally to GE235 by the final report. But the human side of maintenance is confidence. Repeated nuisance messages can breed a quiet skepticism toward what a screen says in a crunch. On the shop floor, engineers pointed to a familiar tension in modern turboprops: the reliance on a single torque signal feeding both ATPCS and cockpit displays, and the potential for a noisy or momentarily spiking sensor to trigger logic that looks, to a pilot, like a flameout even if the engine still produces some power. The fix, when a component misbehaves, is straightforward: isolate, replace, and re-verify. The harder fix is cultural, making sure crews trust the protections when they are truly needed, and know exactly how to respond when automation does not align with expectation. For B22816, the paper trail ends with systems that passed their checks and a cockpit where, seconds later, those checks would matter. No minimum equipment list deferral left the airplane legally compromised, and no open item on engine or propeller control lingered unresolved. The right engine's transient anomaly lit the logic tree as designed. The left engine's shutdown, commanded by human hands, collapsed it. That leaves a more uncomfortable seam to probe: how training, cockpit coordination, and operational tempo shaped the crew's split-second choices when the warnings began to stack. By the time mechanics had cleared the airplane's systems, the only remaining variables were human. That pushed investigators into TransAsia's training rooms, where the ATR 600 syllabus promised to hardwire the very skills that unraveled over the river: engine failure recognition, disciplined callouts, and cockpit teamwork under stress. On paper, the curriculum looked current. Crews transitioning to the 600 completed differences, training for the new glass cockpit, recurrent simulator checks, covered V1 cuts and engine failures after liftoff, and crew resource management modules stressed challenge and response. But training files and interviews revealed seams, scenarios that were predictable in timing, callouts drilled as rote rather than enforced as barriers, and a culture that prized getting through events over stopping them cold when something felt wrong. The captain at the controls of GE-235 had logged thousands of hours, but his records showed rough edges where the accident would later find them. Months before the crash, he struggled in simulator sessions that demanded tight engine-out handling and was assigned remedial training. Instructors noted workload spikes and a tendency to rush memory items. None of that barred him from the line. He eventually passed, as many do after extra sessions. The first officer was comparatively junior on type. Together, they represented a familiar pairing in a rapidly growing carrier, one that had been expanding ATR operations and upgrading pilots from the 500 to the 600. The third pilot in the jump seat, intended as an extra set of eyes, did identify the right engine anomaly aloud early on. What training had not cemented was the authority to halt a captain's wrong hand as it reached for the left condition lever. Inside TransAsia's simulator bay, the engine failure profiles most often appeared as structured drills. Crews were briefed on the event type, the cut arrived predictably at or just after V1, and the reset button was never far away. That style builds muscle memory, but it can also build assumptions. Startle and surprise, the human realities of low-altitude failures were not consistently emphasized. Several pilots told investigators that the ATPCS cues, uptrim and autofeather, were part of the script, called out briskly in the sim because everyone knew they were coming. In the airplane, those cues compete with stall warnings, bank angle calls, and terrain. The exercise of forcing eyes to the correct line on the engine display and of physically guarding the right lever while the wrong one sits temptingly symmetric beside it did not always survive the transition from classroom to cockpit. CRM was taught, but its translation into cockpit behavior proved uneven. The airline's manuals required challenge, confirmation, then action for any condition lever movement. On GE-235, the CVR captured non-standard phraseology and missing confirmations at the decisive moment. That kind of ritual erosion rarely appears out of nowhere. It reflects how check airmen correct, how line captains tolerate deviations, and how often junior pilots practice interrupting a superior. Interviews suggested an authority gradient that flattened in meetings but steepened in the seat. Assertiveness lived in slide decks. In the air, it was tempered by deference and tempo. Tempo mattered. After a high-profile crash the previous summer, TransAsia had come under scrutiny, while still trying to meet schedules and bed in a new variant. Instructor availability was tight. Conversion courses and recurrent checks stacked up. None of that excuses gaps, but it describes a bandwidth problem. In that environment, meet standard can become a ceiling rather than a floor, with extra simulator hours allocated to regaining a pass rather than broadening exposure to messy, unscripted failures. The final report would fault not only the crew's misidentification and breach of procedure, but also the robustness of the company's training philosophy, especially its preparation for surprise, its enforcement of standardized callouts, and its cultivation of intervention when the chain starts to kink. What happened in that cockpit cannot be separated from the institution that staffed it. The drills existed. The logic did too. What was missing was the practiced instinct to slow down, verify, and challenge, even up the chain, when a lever moved toward disaster. Regulators drew the same conclusion in the days after the crash, ordering emergency checks that exposed proficiency gaps across the ATR fleet. To see how oversight amplified those findings, we turn to the audits and retests that followed, and what they revealed about systemic readiness. Regulators had been in TransAsia's orbit long before the wing met the bridge. After the airline's ATR 72-500 went down near Penghu in July 2014, Taiwan's Civil Aeronautics Administration, CAA, launched a round of audits that looked beyond weather decisions to training programs, check airman oversight, and the carrier's safety management system. Corrective action plans followed. Refreshers on standard operating procedures, added emphasis on go-around discipline, promises to tighten simulator grading. Follow-up visits found the paperwork in order. On the ramp and in the simbay, inspectors saw line checks, ticked boxes, and a company busily inducting a newer ATR variant amid a growth spurt. Compliance was measurable, and resilience under surprise was not. Surprise. The morning GE-235 went down. The balance swung from compliance to crisis. Within hours, the CAA convened a press briefing and signaled an extraordinary intervention. The agency ordered TransAsia to ground its ATR pilots for immediate checks on engine failure knowledge and procedures. The first phase was written and oral, no time for elaborate sim scheduling, focused on the muscle memory that should have blocked the wrong lever. Those who failed or did not appear were suspended pending retraining. Only when the airline could show comprehensive requalification would pilots return to line flying. Within days, the CAA layered in simulator evaluations with independent examiners, recreating the very profile that had unraveled over Taipei. An engine anomaly after liftoff, ATPCS cues in play, multiple oral alerts competing for attention. The results were sobering. Examiners reported uneven understanding of the ATR 600's protections, what uptrim meant in practice, how autofeather presented on the displays, when MCT should be set, and inconsistent adherence to the challenge and response barrier before moving a condition lever. In some crews, phraseology drifted from the manual. In others, authority gradients resurfaced, with junior pilots slow to call out missteps. The CAA froze any expansion plans, fined the airline for prior training lapses, and placed monitors in TransAsia's training department to oversee remedial programs. Specific mandates followed. More line-oriented flight training, loft scenarios that injected startle and distraction, additional emphasis on engine identification using instrument cross-checks rather than seat-of-the-pants feel, and stricter standardization among check airmen, so that a pass meant the same thing whichever instructor signed the form. Oversight did not stop at one carrier. The CAA issued advisories to all domestic turboprop operators to rebrief engine-out procedures, review ATPCS arming and indications, and verify that condition lever movements remained gated behind an explicit Identify Confirm Act sequence. ATR and Pratt & Whitney circulated bulletins to their global fleets, clarifying cues and reinforcing procedure, while European regulators amplified the message through safety information notices. Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council, in its final report, took the longer view. It urged the CAA to move beyond checklist compliance toward performance-based oversight that samples how crews actually cope with surprise, to tighten the quality assurance of training organizations, and to use data, flight operational quality assurance programs and line checks, to catch erosion of discipline before an emergency exposes it. In the months that followed, TransAsia's ATR pilots cycled through remedial training and rechecks, and the airline reshuffled training leadership. The CAA lifted suspensions as crews cleared the new hurdle, but the shadow of 2 accidents in 7 months lingered. When the regulator returned for later audits, it found improvements on paper and in the sim, but it also kept a closer grip, more frequent inspections, tougher recurrent checks, and a lower tolerance for almost right in engine-out profiles. The signal was unmistakable. Procedures would no longer be taught as scripts, but enforced as guardrails under stress. Regulatory muscle cannot fly the airplane, but it can shape the environment in which pilots learn, practice, and are held to account. In Taipei, the aftermath revealed a gap between nominal compliance and lived proficiency. A gap closed only when oversight shifted from forms to performance. With the audits, retraining, and policy changes mapped, the chain from cockpit to company to regulator is visible. The remaining question is whether those lessons, written in hard ink, stayed fixed when the headlines faded and the schedules filled again.